All right, here we go with part 2 of our Mod 7 video about GDP. So how does the government calculate the GDP? Like, how do they figure it out? It's such a huge number, $21 trillion just for the US GDP for 2019. Now, how do they figure out these huge numbers? Now, they can't do it exactly, like they can't figure out exactly like the total, like the value of every single thing that was produced in the country, but they can come up with a pretty close estimate. And they have 3 different ways. Now, first, it's the value added approach, where they add together. This definition is a little confusing. It's more like they figure out like the value that was added at each phase of building or of producing something. But don't worry about that. I'm not going to test you on the value added approach. And number 2, they add together the total spending that was done in the economy. That is called the spending approach. It's also, write this in your notes, it's also called the expenditure approach. Expenditure approach. Expenditure means spending, so same thing. And we're going to give this one a star because that's the one we hear about the most, the expenditure approach. And then number 3 is the income approach, where they add together the total amount of income that was earned in the economy, and they figure that by figuring out all of the income that was earned in these various ways listed here, that will get, pretty much the same as the value of all those final goods and services. Your book goes into a lot more detail about that. It's kind of interesting when you read it, but I'm not going to ask you kind of like the nitty-gritty of this stuff. Okay, there you go, $21 trillion. Let's move on to page 3. All right, so page 3, I'll adjust this so you can see it. All right, here we have a little bit of a formula, calculating GDP using the expenditure approach. Now, remember how I said you absolutely need to know the definition of GDP? You also absolutely need to know this formula. So you're going to want to highlight this or make it stand out in some way. You might want to write next to it a star with the words need to know. You need to know that GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX. And you need to know what C and I and G and NX actually mean. Well, C is consumer spending. That is spending done by households or people. Time out. Just a reminder, spending approach or expenditure approach, we're going to measure the value of what was produced by measuring the value of what was spent. It's kind of a backwards way to do it, but it can get them to the same number. So if they measure the value of all of the money that households spent that year, that's consumer spending. So that is spending done by households. And then I, investment spending. Remember last module we discussed what the I means, investment spending. That is spending done by businesses. Okay, government spending, that's easy. Spending done by the government. And last module we talked about how governments spend money too. Government, they buy buildings, they buy cars, they buy computers and chairs and pens, all that stuff. All right, and then net exports, that is exports minus imports. That's what net exports means. Exports minus imports. Now, why do they subtract the imports? Because remember, GDP is only trying to measure the value of what was produced in the country. That's it. And imports, they were not produced here. They were produced in a different country. So they're actually going to subtract those from our GDP, because the money just leaves the country. Remember, imports, the good or service comes into the country and the money leaves. So they subtract the imports because they're not produced in the country. And net exports, is a negative number in the US. It's a negative number. That means that the imports have more value, are a bigger number than the exports. Because, it's exports minus imports. That is not a dash, that is a subtraction symbol. Okay, so if the import is a bigger number than the export, that's going to give you a negative number. All right, so this formula here can get us to the value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. If we add up everything that people spend, everything that businesses spend, everything that governments spend, plus exports minus the imports, we'll get to that $21 trillion. But going back to our definition of GDP, the value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. The key word there is produced. The GDP measures what got made that year in the country. Well, but here we are measuring that by measuring what got spent that year. Well, what about those things that got made but never got bought, which means like nobody spent anything on them? Like if they got made in a year but they didn't get bought, well, they still got made, so they should still count in our GDP. So here we have, what about the things that were produced or made but not sold? Well, that is called a business's inventory. Inventory is the things that a business has. Some people who have had jobs, their bosses tell them to take inventory, and they hate doing that because it means that they're like literally going in the back room and counting all of the stuff that the business has. They're like, oh, we have 8 ketchup bottles. We have 25 rolls of toilet paper. Like they're counting it all because an inventory is like it's just all of the stuff that a company has. So what if somebody made some products and they priced them too high, not enough people wanted to buy them, they never got bought that year? Well, they would go into a company's inventory, and inventory is considered to be a part of investment. And so therefore, inventory is a part of investment spending. So investment spending is not just spending done by businesses, but it's also inventory. Inventory too. Inventory as well. Okay, page 4. All right, so here on page 4, it says what is not included in GDP. Well, this is going to be on the test. And you can't accurately do these types of problems unless you know the definition. So we're going to rewrite our definition. GDP equals the total value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a year. Okay, so there is a bunch of stuff out there that is not included in GDP because it doesn't fit that definition. So intermediate goods, those are also called inputs. We've already talked about those. They are not final goods, and so they don't count. So why are they not included? They are not final goods. They only count the final goods. And we already talked about like they don't count the intermediate goods because then they would be counted more than once. They would be double counted. Used goods are not counted in GDP. So if I went out and I bought a used car, that would not count for consumer spending for GDP. If I went out and I went to the Goodwill and bought some used clothes, not going to count for GDP. And why? Because the GDP measures what was produced in a year. So if I'm talking about the 2020 GDP, If I bought something that was not produced in 2020, it would not count for this year's GDP. So if it's a used good, it was counted in the, don't worry, it's not like it was never counted. It's just not going to count when you buy it as used good. It's going to count when it was bought or produced as a final good in whatever year it was produced in. So used goods are counted in the GDP for the year they were made or produced. Okay. Stocks and bonds. Now, we're not going to learn a lot about stocks and bonds, but we are going to get a definition. So a stock is not a good or a service. It says here a stock is a tiny ownership of a company. So if I buy stock in the Target Corporation, I'm not actually buying a thing. I'm buying like this little tiny ownership of that company, which means that if the company increases in value, my stock increases in value, so then I can like sell it for more than I bought it for. And if I sell it, I get the money, and then the other person who bought it, they get, oh, that little tiny ownership in that company. So it's not a good or a service. It's just like if I had a company and I wanted to like give away ownership of my country or company in return for a bunch of money, I could do that. So that is how stocks work. But for these purposes, what you need to know is that stocks are not goods or services. And a bond is like a loan, it's an IOU, it's not a good or a service, so it doesn't count for GDP. Imports do not count. They're foreign produced goods and services. And not only do they not count, they're actually subtracted from GDP. All right, guys, there was Module 47. Good work. Do your practice problems. Come to the Google Meet and write your summary. Bye, guys.